Okay, we're recording. How are you? My name is Peter, and I wanted to just go over a few things about repairing the non-focusing rcx400 series telescope. I had a problem with my scope last week where it wasn't focusing, and what happens is there are three motors here which control the focus, and they're in the back of the telescope. Okay, and I'll show you that in a second. Back here you have motor, motor, and motor. And what they do is they control these mechanisms up here, this threaded rod and this slider, which then moves the corrector plate assembly forward and backwards, and that's how you focus an RCX series. So what happened in this case is this one here was at the fully inward position and it wasn't working. When you're looking through the telescope and it's not focusing properly, what you'll see is the image will go in and out of collimation. That means that part of the telescope corrector plate is moving forward and backwards, but one part is stuck. So as I was trying to focus, the plate was going this way and that way. All right. Now, to get to it's a bit of a chore, but it's not that difficult. So let's talk a bit about what happens. I've already removed some of the front here. The first thing you want to do is remove this outer shroud, which sits on here and is held on with 1, 2, 3 little hex screws. All right. Once you take that off, you've got this secondary shroud here, and to take that off, again, you need to remove 6 hex, and I've left the last one here because I don't want something clanging off while I'm talking to you. So I've taken off the other 5, and now I'm taking off the 6th one here. And when you're putting these on, it only fits one way, so you can't really put it on upside down or askew. There you go, okay? Be careful with all of your screws. All right. Now you see here, this is the actual corrector plate with its frame. Around it, you'll see the dew strap. And here is the connector for the dew strap, dew heater, okay? Bottom motor and upper motors. So if yours gets stuck and it's just not working, the first thing you do is try to rotate one of these manually with your hands. You don't have to take anything apart, just rotate it manually. Because what probably happened, unless you actually have a burned out motor or a jammed motor, is there's a rod that goes from here to the back of the motor. And I'll try to interspace a still image that I can probably grab off another site. But it looks like this. Behind this shaft is a coupling, and let's just imagine that it looks like this, okay? 2 aluminum tines. And on the actual shaft is another 2 that are like this. Okay, almost like a universal joint. In the middle is an X-shaped rubber pad. Now I've seen photographs in one of the other postings where somebody was saying they didn't have a rubber pad in there. That's a mistake. It probably fell off somewhere because there's no way those pieces will stay aligned and connected without that rubber pad. That rubber pad not only adds vibration dampening but also adds a stiffness. Okay, so that has to be there. And it's an X-shaped rubber pad. When you put it in place here like that, into the tines, it leaves 2 openings on the other side for the other piece to fit in, you see? And that's how it fits, like that. There's one here, there's one on the back. Don't believe it. If someone tells you there isn't, there is. Unless some weird modification was made afterwards, which makes no sense at all. So, let's go to the back for a second. In order to remove the back to access the motors, you have 4 hex fasteners here, and these are 1/8. Let me just get that off here for a second. 1/8 hex. I'm not going to remove this fully off because there is a connector for the fan, and I've already glued it back in place because all of the actual connections have a little bit of a soft glue on them. So when you remove this, you just do one side and the other, and you see right here, that's the actual motor, fan rather. Now, the motor that was giving me problems was this one here, okay? If you want to take this out, you disconnect the coupling, which you can either do it here, but it's a little awkward because it's still in there and it's glued together. But more likely, you can trace the wires by wiggling them to find out which of these connectors it is the top one, and actually it's this one right here. Undo the glue, remove that gently, do the same thing with the motor power coupler, which is this one here, and I believe it's the second one, or the third one anyways. Same thing, you can just figure out which one it is, and then you can feed the wires back through. There's a ferrite loop here, which is stuck on the back with some double-sided tape. You may have to undo that, and then we do it later. Then you've got two hex nuts here, 1/8 inch, and these are not adjustable. So once you get them in there, there's only one way to fit them in. And then the entire assembly comes out. There is a diode board on the back for the encoder. Be very careful you don't break that little wheel, or you're in trouble. Be very careful you don't break the connections. So always lift it out from the metal frame. Okay. When you take that out, you'll see the shaft to be inside, and it might be loose because, of course, it fell off the actual coupling either at the front or at the back, which is the problem. So you can take that out with a pair of tweezers. This, by the way, is an exterior housing, and there's another interior housing. So you do not go from this right to your optics. You go from this to an interior housing. Your optics are inside that, so you're not going to scratch anything if you remove the motor. I'm going to put this back in place. A little bit of tape there so that the wires don't pinch when you're trying to put the back on. Okay. And whoops, there you go. One side and the other. And that pretty well stays in place. And I'm going to put one screw in the back, just partially in, so that it can be accessed later a little more easily. Okay, so once you get that off, I wanted to remove this assembly because there was no other way to get to that coupling. And then I found that I had to remove the corrector plate. Now, to remove the corrector plate is actually pretty easy. Undo your strap right here, the connector that they're for, and it's kind of hard to tell, but inside the first ring and the back ring, there's a second ring here. I'll show you from this side. You see this ring right here? This ring here is connected to the focusing mechanisms. This is for your corrector plate. Unlike the C8s and the Meade 2080s and whatnot, the corrector plate is not sitting within the frame on itself. So if you were to go to a C8 or a 2080 and you remove the front ring screws, the ring will come off, and then you can turn it over and pull the plate right out, and it says raw glass. In this case, it's already in the cell, so when you're removing your corrector plate, it stays within the cell. Unless you have to get to it for some reason, why would you want to do that? Now, the good thing about that is that when you're reconnecting it, there are only 6 hex screws, 2, 4, 6, and there's an alignment pin in here. Okay? So it's obvious how it fits. When you're getting it back on, it may not sit exactly flat because it's a very, very tight machine fit, but when you get it in there and you gently snug up these, then the tension will be taken up and it'll sit properly. When you're putting it back in place though, you see here, there are 3 wire groups that come through the back ring to the corrector plate, and they are for the dew heater, and they're grooves in the back ring. So you have to make sure you don't pinch those, otherwise you could short them out. In my case, what I did is I removed this bracket, aligned everything, put the bracket back on. Now, I had to move this whole thing forward in order to access the screws to remove this bracket, because if you see here, it's hard to tell, I know, there are 2 screws underneath the ring, and then there's one right there. So that's easy to get to. Those 2 you cannot if the focus plate is all the way at the back. So I had to make sure everything was plugged in and use my focus to bring the plate forward as much as I could, except for this one side, of course. And then I had to turn that one manually. And if you want to go out, then you have to turn it clockwise from the front, and that will work the mechanism forward. If the mechanism is jammed in some way with dirt or with a damaged thread, that perhaps could be the problem. But in this case, it wasn't. So I didn't see anything physical on that rod, on the threaded rod in there. So I brought that back up, and you bring it up to so that they're at the same level, all 3, and that gives you rough collimation. And then you can access the back screws. Again, this is after the corrector plate has been taken out. If you want to go back to the corrector plate for a second, put this in the near vertical position, not fully vertical. Loosen all 6, and then have your hand here with some lens cleaning material like cloth or whatever, the silicone cloth, whatever you want to call it, and then gently put it pointing down, and this plate should come out. If not, then you get your fingers and then just gently push it out, okay? What I also did is I detached these springs. Now before you do that, you don't want the springs bouncing in there, so what I did is I used some twist ties to loop onto the spring, and then I pull the spring outward while I put a hex key in the loop, and then let that rest against the body here, because I didn't want to go fishing for stuff. That may not have been necessary, but I did it anyways. Then I remove this here. Before you do that, you uncouple the fastener. Keep in mind that inside the that assembly, underneath the limiter dial board, and you see you have these 3 boards here, 1, 2, 3. They have dials on either side, and this little limiting arm here. This arm doesn't actually touch anything, it just blanks out the signal between sender and receiver. And when the signal is blanked out, it tells the telescope that you're at one limit or another. In this case, when I was testing the motor, and I'll get back to that in a second, I couldn't test it in both positions because it would only turn in one direction because it was getting a false signal from the front. Okay, so we'll get back to that in a moment. When you want to remove this, again, remove the connection, gently remove these 2 hex nuts here, and underneath this little board are 2 spacers. They're not very big, but they're big enough so that you can drop them, lose them pretty quickly. When you're putting it back on, make sure that the board is placed in such a way that the limiters don't hit the actual diodes. Make sure that the travel is smooth and unobstructed. Let's go back to the motor for a second, okay? When you take the motor off, the back motor, and then you'll see again a coupler on the back with another one of those rubber X rings. All right, I wanted to test the motor operation, so what I did is I made sure everything was plugged in. I turned on my hand control on my the unit rudder. Obviously I don't go through the whole setup, and after the welcome to AutoStar, it'll get there. Okay, go to focus. And you see, I think my control's a bit dirty, but everything is moving nicely. Anyways, when the motor is out and you're holding it by the frame, make sure the connector's back on there, by the way, and the power wire. Then you could test the motor forward and a reverse operation with your hand control. If it's moving in both cases and you don't feel any slack on the coupler, maybe the shaft is loose, then the motor should be okay. If it only goes in one direction, even though you've got the front plugged in and it's not at the limits, it could be an indication that there's a problem with the motor or there's a problem with the connector or the board or something. That's a little bit beyond my experience, but luckily everything was working okay. Putting the motor back in was a pain in the rear. What I had to do is I had to couple the front assembly with the shaft outside of the unit. I put some tape around the front coupling to make sure that nothing slipped off, because it's very easy for it to slip off when you try to put it back in. Then I put this in the vertical position, downwards rather, with the back opening straight up, and then you can see where the coupling was and the rubber shaft. Now to get the motor back on is very difficult with the L bracket on, so what I have to do there, I'm going to shut this off here, is I had to carefully remove, oops, much worse, trying to be extra careful and beat it harder on myself. anyways, you see this side here, it's a little bit more clear. This whole assembly again is out. You reconnect, well, you don't have to reconnect this first. You remove the 4 hex nuts here, of hex bolts, that are going through the rubber bushings. Shock absorbers, what do you call it? And the bracket here, the L-shaped bracket, it's non-adjustable. In other words, once you get it aligned and you put it in place, that's it. So once that's off, you have to then, holding the outer part of the motor body, the frame, then you align that with the coupler. And you have to wiggle it a bit, put it back in position. And when you're holding it with one hand, go back to the front with the other hand and see if you can feel any resistance. If you do, the coupler is still connected. If not, then it probably slips off of the back. Because again, you have to get them right in there. Otherwise, if it's just partially, it'll just slip right off. And once you know that it's in there, hold that in position with one hand, while with the other hand, you reposition the L bracket and get the top 2 hex nuts in there, the hex bolts rather, and then the bottom 2. And they're very, very stiff to get in there. You have to really push this bracket down. And then again, test it again before you reassemble everything. Test by reconnecting the motors. First of all, feel for tension, and if you haven't lost tension in the front, you should be okay. Reconnect your motors here, reconnect your assembly here, and then, or here, depending on how you do it, whether you do both sides or not. Also, keep in mind that these are directional. On the motors, the blue is facing outwards. On the board, the blue is facing downwards. And I believe that if you put it in the wrong way, the wires will be reversed. Then you're going to be reversing your motor leads for sure, and then also your signal leads. So that can cause problems. Okay, do not reverse those. Do not reverse those. Do not reverse those. Draw something if you have to. We're going to put this back in. Look at that. That back on. And also, before you fasten everything up, test your fan operation as well to make sure that you got that connection back in place. Get in there, you can get in there. Anyways, there you go. All right. So I'll just put one back in place for now. Okay. Then I will go back to the front. You've cleaned your corrector plate. You've blown out any dust, because a little bit of dust will go in there, and you see a little bit of gotten in there during this video. I'm not too worried about that. And then you reposition this shroud. Now in my case, I have a little piece of Velcro up on top because I had to make a cap. I know this is the top, but if you look at it, these are spaced in such a way that they fit over the motor assemblies, or the focus assemblies rather, and they can only really fit in one direction. So there you go. Where am I? There you go. Make sure the thing is pinched, and if this is sitting flatly on these brackets, you can put those back in place. In that case, you need an altogether different size hex. There are 3 different sizes you need. One for the back is 1/8, and for the motor front assemblies are 1/8, and for the motor rear mounting is 1/8. And then for the front, I think it's 3 32nds and 7 64ths. So you'll figure it out. They're not very big, and these are imperial. So I'm just going to take my sweet time here. Okay. That's what, now I've got those on. And then you put the front shroud back on with 1, 2, 3 hex. Before you do, if you want to be extra careful, again, Check your focus travel back and forth. Check your collimation adjustments. All right, since you've got everything apart, make sure that these are clean. I put a little bit of very high quality machine oil on all the threaded rods after I wiped everything off, the degrease, and also on the actual shafts themselves. And then I put a little bit of hot glue on top of the connector once I was happy with everything. And again, when you're putting the board back in, make sure that the limiter arm does not hit the actual diodes. Okay, there's not a lot of adjustment there, but there's just enough to cause a problem if you don't have it right. And that's it. So I hope this has been a help to somebody. I'm going to see if I can interface some photographs of the motor assembly, the focuser assembly, and the actual arm. I believe I have those somewhere in my other video, but I was having problems with the codecs, and I just kind of edited it together, so I thought I'd do another one. Have yourself a great day. Bye-bye.